Thank you very much for coming. We are excited to welcome you to today's proceedings, where we have the 6 papers to be given by the workshop participants. As we were saying last night, I see many familiar faces from last night. This is the opening workshop, the first of 3 workshops over 3 years under the umbrella title People of the Sand, People of the Tent, Archaeological Perspectives on Mobility and Fluidity in Arid Regions of Western and Central Asia. We're, of course, especially grateful to various funding bodies whose generosity has allowed us to meet here in New York City, to have a place to gather in safety and community, unlike many scholars and teachers around the world today. We also would like to acknowledge the Rosemarie Lewent Conference on Ancient Studies and NYU's Center for Ancient Studies, directed by Matthew Santarocco. Matthew's intrinsic support for our project, his encouragement and his advice have been instrumental in getting us here today. We'd also like to acknowledge Anna Donch, sitting over here. She's the program administrator at the center, and her behind the scenes work has ensured that everything runs and continues to run smoothly. Thank you both for all that you do. We'd also like to acknowledge the GNU, NYU's Global Network University, the fund that facilitates such meetings designed to bring together scholars from across NYU's global network and beyond. I'd also like to acknowledge the New York University Abu Dhabi Dean of Arts and Humanities, Awam Amka, whose early support for our workshop idea allowed us to start planning this first meeting. And the NYU Abu Dhabi Research Institute, whose support will allow us to continue our conversation about mobility this time next year in Abu Dhabi. So, mobility. Mobility matters. It's demonstrably current. It forms a subtext to many of the headlines we wake up to each morning. But people's movements, voluntary, forced, how and why they move, have shaped society and affected human culture for millennia. Today, mobility remains both a foundational concern and a rich opportunity for governments and institutions around the world as they grapple with increasing numbers of people on the move due to war, religion, climate crises, politics, and economics. This workshop has been over 5 years in the making. Yifat Thareani, who will be speaking soon, and I started talking about this collaborative endeavor in 2019 when we first met. Mobility, and here we're thinking more specifically about nomads, was an obvious starting point to allow us to consider Western and Central Asia under one intellectual umbrella, incorporating a theme that resonated across deep time up to today. After all, long-distance land and sea routes have linked the Afro-Eurasian landmass for millennia. The term people of the sand, people of the tent came up during one of our conversations, and given its familiarity across our regions of study, the direct link to mobility and an oblique reference to ecology, it seemed apt. Yet few studies attempt what we are attempting to do with our project, a longue durée perspective on arid regions to reframe questions of mobility and fluidity. After all, there seems to be a general consensus that one of the main characteristics of mobile populations is their diverse practices, often contingent on the ecotones they inhabit. Yet a major stumbling block to broader discussions about nomads and mobility rests on terminology. Even within just Central Asian archaeology, discussions in the recent literature about the terminology we use to refer to nomads is laden. A quick perusal of this literature underlines the many words we use: pastoralists, mobile pastoralists, agro-pastoralists, mobile populations, to name a few. By inviting a small but dynamic group of scholars who will be presenting their work today, with diverse training across key regions of the Old World, Israel, the Gulf, Israel and the Levant, the Gulf and Central Asia, we envisage that such diversity will serve to facilitate robust opportunities to achieve the ultimate goal of this first workshop, a working definition of mobility. We look forward to the papers that we will be hearing over the course of the day to discuss mobility across Western and Central Asia. And our first session is on the Levant. Professor Schiffman will be chairing this first panel. I would just like to formally introduce Larry Schiffman to you. Lawrence Schiffman is a global distinguished professor of Hebrew and Judaic studies at New York University. He's a specialist in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Judaism in late antiquity, the history of Jewish law, and Talmudic literature. His many publications include From Text to Tradition, a history of Second Temple and Rabbinic Judaism, Reclaiming the Dead Sea Scrolls, Qumran and Jerusalem, Studies in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the History of Judaism, The Temple Scroll with A.D. Gross, and more than 200 articles on the Dead Sea Scrolls and Rabbinic Judaism. He co-edited the Encyclopedia of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the award-winning Outside the Bible, Ancient Jewish Writings Related to Scripture, and the 5-volume series, An End to Anti-Semitism. That's a lot of work. I turn the floor over to Professor Schiffman. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you, Fiona, for your, and of course, I got one in my hand, okay. And we should probably start by saying that this organization of this tremendous event, the one person who wasn't thanked is Fiona, who together with Yifat has come up with this wonderful program for us. So we thank you too. I think you thanked Yifat, but we got to get you in too. So this is a pleasure for me. I don't want to speak for more than a minute or two, but still I want to say it's a pleasure to me because I'm getting to introduce two people who are friends and colleagues, and we're happy to have them here with us today. And I think those of us who were here last night already realized that we're really being exposed to a wonderful way of looking at some things that we may have looked at differently, and that this new perspective will be, I think, very, very helpful to everyone who is here. Now, our first speaker in this session is going to be Yifat Thareani. She's the director of the new program in archaeology at NYU in Tel Aviv. She's a research archaeologist also at the Nelson Glick School of Biblical Archaeology of Hebrew Union College, and director of a Tel Dan excavation in northern Israel. And Dr. Thareani was born in Tel Aviv. I don't know if to give you away your birthday. I have your birthday on here. I don't know. She is. She was a postdoc in various places in France. It's a long list, and she's worked at quite a number of excavations, as everyone knows. She completed her degrees, BA, MA, PhD in archaeology at Tel Aviv University, right? And she wrote on a subject having to do with towns of the desert, which has got to do with what we are doing here. And I think we're going to get some perspective from that as well. She directs the Tel Dan excavations for the Nelson Glick School of Biblical Archaeology. Since 2000, she's the founder and director of the Multicultural Scouts House of Eitan in South Tel Aviv. I know she's very proud of this work, home for more than 300 children of undocumented work immigrants and refugees. Now, Dr. Thareani is going to be speaking to us on the topic of planting roots in shifting sands, a travel account for a first millennium BCE trade caravan. Please, Dr. Thareani.
I think we already opened. Yeah, that's the one. Thank you so much. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Fiona. Yeah, I'm a little bit tall. Thank you.
That may be my job. Remind you to speak.
Thank you. Yeah, it's an important job. Good morning. Thank you and welcome. And I'm very happy to open this fabulous event for us desert people who are used to work on the margins of society in a way. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you. As a place without compromise, deserts express life in their extreme. Dry, hot, and hostile, desert is the place of wanderers and worshippers. Some would argue that, like the seas, desert unite rather than divide. Bearing witness to thousands of years of changing modes between nomadization, urbanization, and both, The southern Levantine desert has hosted communities of traders who used as entrepreneurs, bridging over troubled sands. There, ancient caravans traveled long distances, carrying goods such as precious stones and spices, acquiring them from a particular source and transporting them. Often, the destination were important, but the journey could be too. The value of the object has been related as much to the journey that was made to acquire it. As the first of 3 lectures, this talk offers a travel account of a trade caravan from the first millennium BCE. Our search for the mobility patterns that are reflected through the archaeological record will go through historiography, theory, and methodology. The data and synthesis will be analyzed in our next meetings, which I'm very much looking forward to. First, the imagery space will be addressed. References to nomads, camels, and exotic goods making their way to ancient royal courts have led many scholars to assume that imperial conquest stimulated the growth and prosperity of the long-distance trade across the Arabian desert in the first millennium BCE, connecting the region with the Persian Gulf to the east and with the international ports and land routes along the Mediterranean coast to the west. Inspired by the frequent appearances of Arabs in Assyrian inscriptions and reliefs and in the Bible, and charmed by an ever-growing assemblage of archaeological finds, scholars of the past century have depicted the trade as a series of straight lines, resulted with a passive, static, and isolated image of the communities who participated in it. Contrary to the social sciences that observe mobility as it happens, archaeology operates in the other end of the continuum. Our subjects for the movement have already moved, and the image presented is that of the end of the movement rather than its duration. Often conceived as a static and flat, the Arabian trade was a patchwork image inspired by a mixture of bias and facts, impressions and wishful thinking. In a remarkable way, the ancient Assyrian line of thinking was projected through the common Western perception of the ancient Arabs and the trade, a view that was itself an outcome of a contemporary colonial and imperial historical reality. The so-called incense trade was understood as a unidirectional movement of commodities from an uncivilized periphery to the well-organized imperial core, intermediated by nomads and client kings. These rather simplistic theories disregarded the benefits and the social response of the indigenous societies to this kind of globalization, a denial that once again turned the nomads, or the semi-nomads, into the passive objects of their own history. Now it seems that we have reached a point where we can no longer discuss the scientific treatment of the trade without overcoming these challenges and creating a thicker and more balanced view of the past. Our challenge is to adopt a mobile approach by bringing movement and life to what appeared to be the fixed static material, in order to unveil the reality behind the trade of the first millennium BCE, the economic network, the strategies, and the agents who participated in the commercial enterprise will be discussed. It is assumed that the natural movement of local semi-nomads across the desert has a materiality discernible within the archaeological record. In addition to the imagery space that addressed the historiography of the trade, 3 kinds of spaces from the theoretical basis, the theoretical basis of this study: the realistic, the political, and the symbolic one. Realistic space refers to the physical location where interaction occurs, values are exchanged, and people collaborate. The functional aspect aspires to explore caravan trade as an operation with strategies and tactics. Here, the role of mobility will revolve around structuring the use and inhabitation of desert landscape. Local topography, human and animals involved, water sources, distance, and services will be spatially mapped. Political space is where social groups, whether external or internal, exercise power and interest, interact and counteract. It thus refers to those socio-political practices that are applied on the geography, economy, history, borders, and conflicts. Analyzing the space politically owns the potential of uncovering the non-static character of desert and the dialogue maintained between local groups, especially local agents, and external powers such as kingdoms and empires. Symbolic space means interaction with specific cultural and spiritual meanings, values, and associations that the ancients related to the road. It is surmised that the cognitive meanings and symbolic organization of desert trade received its expression along the routes, in road shrines, sacred natural elements, and in urban centers. In areas wherein identity and sovereignty are negotiated, imaginatively and discursively in relation to the necessary other. How then to transform the realistic, the political, and the symbolic spaces into a useful methodological model that will be applicable on ancient trade caravans? One way to help us follow the movement of things is the chaîne opératoire method. One moment. As a methodological concept, the chaîne opératoire argued that technical gestures are conscious and deliberate, a transmitted habitus or a way of doing, whilst maintaining that these gestures are socially and historical context dependent and cannot be investigated in isolation from one another. First introduced into French ethnography, the term chaîne opératoire was defined as techniques which involve both gestures and tools organized in a chain by a veritable syntax that simultaneously grants to the operational series their fixity and flexibility, highlighting the sequential obtaining of raw materials and their fashioning into finished objects with the human action. The chaîne opératoire gradually developed a linear description of raw materials into a usable object to the socio-contextual importance, limitations, constraints, and possibilities of the process and those individuals involved. In the relationship between things and people, chains are seen as an aspect of a lived reality in which both social and material domains are entangled and act upon one another. Therefore, the chaîne opératoire inherited traits allow us to explore caravans as economic, political, and symbolic charged phenomenon. With the main objective to explore the caravan's movement as an operation, its strategies and tactics as material practice, and the role of the Negev community in advancing understanding about the use of the real political and symbolic landscape that continue to be inhabited by people on the move, the first stage of our caravan journey will examine environments and practices that are associated with the trade. Next, we shall refer to the socio-political organization of the caravans, the kind of monuments that the caravaneers saw and visited in the way, and the messages that these features conveyed. Finally, the cognitive aspects of the caravan trade will be explored by referring to the rituals and symbolic meanings that the southern Levantine desert summoned to its travelers. In adopting such an approach, I would try to decode aspects of choice, agency, and symbolic value of the caravan in order to highlight the complexity of the steps involved in the initiation and the practice of the trade. With the notion that material makes movement, a careful chaîne opératoire of the archaeology and history of the southern Levantine caravan trade will help us to study the flows between the static materials and the moving bodies. Hence, to go on an imagined journey of a first millennium BCE caravan trade from Arabia to a Mediterranean port. From the moment of its initiative to its organization and departure, we will move with the caravan, explore the trade routes and road stations and shrines, the interaction with desert towns, and with representatives of the ruling power. Since mobility requires a bottom-up approach, a thicker description, a set of archaeological expectations will be outlined to specify those functions and needs that derive from each dimension, the realistic, the political, and the symbolic. Situated in the southern part of nowadays Israel, at the frontiers between Israel, Jordan, and Egypt, the Negev desert is characterized by an increasing aridity from north to south and by an average annual precipitation of less than 200 millimeters. Nonetheless, and along the barren areas existed several improved ecological niches that enabled the development of thriving urban communities in the past. With this, one counts the semi-arid zones of the Beersheba Valley and the Arad Plain, the Negev Mountain, and parts of the Sinai Peninsula. Along the West Survey of the Negev Desert reveals the function of trade as a catalyst of cultural and social change. The road connecting between the Dead Sea and Egypt in the early Bronze Age, contacts with Wadi Feinan and Transjordan in the Iron Age 2A, the Arabian trade route of the Iron Age 2 BC, the Nabatean trade of the Roman period, the pilgrim roads leading and from Sinai in the Byzantine era, and the Egyptian and Syrian Hajj ways of the Ottoman period. Unique cultural, historical, climate stimulated the development of a flourishing trade system that crossed through the Arava Desert and the Beersheba Valley during the imperial eras. For the Iron Age too, the advent of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, its political interests and territorial conquest in the Levant was followed by economic prosperity, the Pax Syriaca, that brought relative stability and peaceful times to the region. An array of artifacts support this view and illustrates the commercial activity that took place in the region as part of the long-distance Arabian trade. Through exploring the realistic space, I wish to offer a more nuanced understanding of the practical aspects of the caravan trade in the first millennium BCE. Here, a set of questions will be raised concerning the physicality and the practice of the caravans, distance to be covered, water and feeding management, the performance of pack animals, and the role of containers in transport and storage. Caravans used to travel in fixed seasons and times. Guided by caravaneers, experienced people who have taken the road many times and who knew how to deal with the problems that were bound to come. The roads available to them were fairly known, and they would have had a choice of several routes. Extensive surveys across the Negev Desert indicated a complex map of many roads. The common appearance of ancient road on the flat terrain is a band of trails, a strip of varying width. Some roads are 100 to 200 meters wide, but many others are only a few meters wide. That these roads have been in a continuous use is indicated by artifacts from the trail's surface, yielding assemblage from the early Neolithic to near present. As indicated by Uzi Avner, this is part of a dense road network of which the dominant direction is from southeast to northwest. Indeed, these roads were part of an international system connecting Arabia with the Mediterranean. Coming from the south, passing from the Arava to Chatzeva, turning to the Beersheba Valley, and then crossing through the western Negev to the coast, the trade road incorporated several short intersecting roads that were located on the east-west axis and that led from Edom to the sea as well. Starting from Chatzeva, the road crossed through Uza, Malchata, Kitmit, and Aroer along the western part of the Beersheba Valley, close to Tel Ira, Tel Masos, Tel Shera, Tel Haror, and finally Gaza. How long was the journey from Arabia to the Negev? Studies of the Near Eastern caravans of the 18th and 19th century CE show one travels at a speed of 5 kilometers per hour, 6 hours a day. This means that a distance of circa 700 kilometers from Taima to the Negev would last 23 days. From southern locations such as Al-Ula to Beersheba, 800 kilometers would span 27 days. If the caravan wanted to get to a Mediterranean port like Gaza, 41 kilometers were added. In some cases, there were topographical obstacles that consumed more time, thus assuming a month of travel for our caravan seems reasonable. Yet the journey itself must have been physically exhausting, even for well-experienced travelers, especially in the summer. In what ways animals were involved and treated? Different variables play a role in determining an appropriate pack load: size and weight, the physical condition of individual pack animal, the terrain to be crossed, and the intended speed and the length of journey. Camels and donkeys are both well adapted to hot and dry climates, tolerating dehydration of up to 25 and 30% of body weight. Sumerian donkeys, caravan from the 3rd millennium BCE, included 200 donkeys. In the famous Cappadocian merchant colonies, when Assyrian merchants exercised a brisk caravan trade in tea, textile, and silver, some 20 donkeys and an equal number of men were required for a caravan. In the first half of the first millennium BCE, camel caravans were composed of at least 200 camels, as reported by a Sabaean caravan in the Assyrian sources. Strabo described the Nabatean caravan as being as big an army. One moment. 19th century CE caravans in the Arabian Peninsula might range from a few dozen to several hundred camels. It necessitated some kind of organization and sequence around watering places, since not all animals could drink at the same time. Normal food intake of camels is relatively low, about 10 to 20 kilograms of green food per day, or as much as dates can be gathered together twice in 2 hands. In long-distance transport, with daily long marches, camels should not carry more than about one-third of their live weight, while donkeys may carry 1/3 to 1/2 of their weight. Donkey loads, center well in the range of 60 to 75 kilograms. Figures on camel loads show a range centering at 130 to 200 kilograms. Loading and unloading of animals consume time, and they have to be watered and fed. Moreover, there had to be animals to carry the caravan's fodder. Thus, a certain number of camels could not use to carry goods. As the most frequent objects found along ancient caravan routes, ceramics own the potential for studying transport logistics. Of this, store jars make up the great share, with a capacity ranging between 6 to 30 kilograms for storing of high-value commodities. Some goods were packed in smaller parcels. Late caravans report water skins, usually of sheep and goat, as typical containers for 25 to 30 liters of water. Beyond the realistic space that the Arid zone was, there were other material properties that manifested socio-political dynamics. In the desert, architectural forms conveying political messages appeared more extensively in times of imperial rule, when desert communities came into contact with the outside world. As a body on the move, ancient trade caravans were exposed to a host of cultural and political messages. A mid-8th century BCE cuneiform inscription, commissioned by Ninurta Kuduri Ushu, a largely independent governor, Sakin Mati of Sukhu and Mari in the Middle Euphrates region, claims that this ruler organized a raid on a caravan of the people of Tema and Saba near the town of Hindanu, and took camel's wool, iron, and precious stones as booty from them. It is quite likely that the caravan was on its way or back from Assyria. On their way, caravan leaders had to make some payments to officials or local towns. In another text, Adahati, the Assyrian governor of Hamat, reports that Arabs had attacked a caravan carrying booty from Damascus to Assyria and had escaped with their loot. Caravans of the Ottoman period were also exposed to a constant threat of robbery and attack by Bedouins and of wild animals. Hence, caravan personnel were armed. Although more people were added, security degree in the road was an outcome of the agreements reached with local semi-nomadic rulers, masters of the desert roads. In those moments, the agency of certain individuals, especially local elites who were both insiders and outsiders, were of utmost importance for mediating the economic and social transaction. In such system, trust was fundamental. Some of the Assyrian caravans were individual, forming kind of a partnership. Masters gave silver talents to their servants in the Bible as well, upon a living to the long journey, while some of the commerce must have been smuggled into town. There, along the trade routes, imperial or state structures in central locations conveyed a strong message about who owns the road. Previously, I suggested that some of the objects found in the Iron Age II Negev sites were used as an expression of and as means to declare power and social status among local elite groups of common tribal origin that were active in the region and who settled down in urban centers by maintaining contacts with the Assyrian royal courts. The acquaintance of these local tribal groups with the geographical sphere located to the south of the Judean kingdom. Their control over desert routes and their specialization in trade meant that they became ideal intermediaries in the Arabian trade system. The role of agency that these tribal groups played was an important factor in the long-distance trade, which linked and generally harmonized the economic and political interests of the Assyrian Empire and the Judean kingdom. It was for this reason that local tribal groups were motivated to settle in Negev sites side by side with the Judean population. Here, the social and physical connectivity that local agents fulfilled in the trade are exposed, but also the resilience of local desert population in spite of political upheavals, an outcome of their fluid character and ability to adjust to different circumstances. In a recent conference in Paris, and Jérôme was there as well, dedicated to the Arabian routes, I suggested that imperial structures were located from the two sides of Wadi Araba. The impressive remains found at Busayra and their resemblance to Assyrian motifs known from Assyria proper support the assumption that by the end of the 8th century BCE, Assyrians were physically present in the Edomite plateau. An Assyrian center was built, presenting imperial ceremonies, storage, and administrative services, and Assyrian administrative personnel were stationed within the subjugated Edomite kingdom. Malchata's location at the heart of the biblical Negev, its distinctive plan, large-scale use of mud bricks, and unique material culture all attest to an Assyrian presence and involvement in the Arabian trade system. This kind of midway control strategy, namely stationing an imperial structure within the territory of a client kingdom, is also evidenced in nearby areas and in other imperial periods. Agreements signed between the Roman Byzantine imperial administration and local elites of semi-nomadic groups residing in the Negev frontier allowed units of soldiers or veterans who continued to live in the region to be hired as protectors of desert towns and roads. Caravansaries and road stations that were located every 25 to 30 kilometers provided food and shelter for the caravans. Here you can see our reconstruction for the Iron Age II caravanserai at Tel Aroer. In the early days that followed the foundation of Beersheba in 1917, loyal to empire's will to pacify the desert frontier, the Ottoman governor granted the local Bedouin tribes the right to elect their new town's governor. Like their Assyrians and Roman predecessors, there was a clear economic gain for the local semi-nomadic elite. Sheikhs of the large tribes in the Negev profited from the high price of the Ottoman government paid for their lands and maintained homes in town, while resuming to practice semi-nomadic subsistence economy. How the caravans were organized and valued, who charged the tolls. Letters from the El Amarna archive indicate that during the late Bronze Age, the responsibility for the organization of the caravans was laid upon the local rulers who were subjected to the Egyptian pharaoh. The protection of traveling caravans between Egypt and Western Asia was guaranteed by local Canaanite kings. Of course, these caravans had to pay taxes to these kings in return. The ruler of Pichilu, modern Tabakat Fahil in the Jordan Valley, Mutbaalu, the son of Labayu, ruler of Shechem, sent a letter to the Egyptian pharaoh in which he wrote, "Let the king, my lord, send a caravan even to Kardanias, which is Babylon. I will personally conduct it under very heavy guard." The king of Jerusalem, Abdichiba, sent a letter to the Egyptian king describing a serious criminal situation and asking him for help. He adds, "May the king, my lord, know that I am unable to send a caravan to the king, my lord." From this short description, we may deduce that desert communities of traders were neither closed nor hostile. Perhaps, as Robert McAdams suggested, we should refer to them as entrepreneurs, conscious agents of exchange and contact. That some trips ended badly was well known in antiquity, as the desert was fraught by dangerous creatures and robbers. Blood, oh blood, the black dog lurks on a mound, waiting for the scattered caravan, looking out for a good man. The old Assyrian incantation continues with a plea to the gods for protection. Before a new trip, a sheep or goat could have been sacrificed to the gods who safeguard against horrible threats, human or demon. Sometimes a sheep would be killed at a certain dangerous locations along the road. Ottoman caravans submitting a plea to the gods for protection was a natural thing to do. Ancient Near Eastern sources reflect much anxiety in regard to the safety of the caravans. Oh, Shamash, the caravan which passed along a road of terror addresses you. One must assume that these anxieties were spatially met. Several deities appear to have had the function of protecting the caravans. The god Shamash, in addition to his main function as a god of justice, was also responsible for the safety of caravans. The Nabatean god, Shai al-Kum, was the caravan god. Originally, he was a North Arabian tribal god, and his name means protector of the tribe. Since the desert was a place of danger and navigating desert routes necessitated the protection and guidance of the gods, ancient desert routes inhabited various cultic installations, shrines, and temples where ritual practices were performed. Among the Iron Age two sites stands out in isolation Chorvat Kitmit, two structures built around a central courtyard where distinctive material culture, which is alien to the common Judean assemblage, was unearthed. The unique material culture and its strong connection with forms and styles that are presented in Edomite sites brought scholars to identify the place as a roadside shrine for local semi-nomads with an Edomite orientation. While the Temple of Arad, used for Judean population, for the Roman period, sites associated with Nabatean cult and mortuary practices were surveyed in the Negev, attesting at a vast semi-nomadic presence. A relief representing two gods, the first is seated on a camel, the second deity behind is on a horseback. In the right hand they hold spears. Before the two gods there stands a priest turned to the right, offering them a sacrifice of incense over a burning altar. An inscription of 4 lines in Palmyran, dated to 113 CE, may be translated. To Arsu and Azizu, the good gods who reward, Baali has made this, son of Yarchibol, priest of Azizu, the God and merciful, benevolent God, for his safety and that for his brothers. Arsu and Azizu, besides being the nightlights of the desert sky and the sacred means of transport across the desert, were also powerful protectors of caravans against all forces of evil, especially brigands and raiders, who might attack the clever organizer of the complicated machine that the ancient caravan was. For caravaneers practicing navigation, cosmology must have played a special role. Overland long-distance trade was based on the movement of relatively lightweight, high-value goods over large distances. While scholars have emphasized the origin and the destination of the traded goods, it is important for us to acknowledge the movement of people, animals, and objects in an attempt to bridge the distance between Arabia, the Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, and the Persian Gulf. Practicing the trade caravan successfully required complex processes of decision-making, in which all variables, good destinations, time, rates, routes, means of transport, etc., must be strategically handled in the short, medium, and long term. In his study about the Sudanese mountain fool, the social anthropologist Frederick Barth put forward the people without history in the sense that almost all accounts of them were written by biased outsiders. He surmised that the flow of goods and services is socially patterned in discrete spheres. Social barriers prevent the movement between these spheres, and entrepreneurial activity along the barriers takes advantage of the relatively scarce means by which the barriers may be breached. He further maintained that entrepreneurs will direct their activity preeminently towards those points in an economic system where the discrepancies of evaluation are greatest, and will attempt to construct bridging transactions which can exploit those discrepancies. A chaîne opératoire of the first millennium BCE caravan trade from Arabia to the Levant has the potential to shed light on the importance of mobile communities' capacity to modify their arid environment by virtue of cultural, social, and political context. A central issue in the caravanier's lifeway was them being fluid, but at the same time related to structure, and having a broad range of mechanisms to articulate themselves with other groups and to navigate them strategically according to the changing conditions of the physical, political, and the symbolic landscape. Thank you so much.
Okay, we can have time for, let's say, 2 questions before we go on. And if we have anybody who would like, we are coming with the microphone. Somebody have a question? Nobody has a question. Okay. If nobody has a question, then we will go on. No? Okay. I guess people want to stay to our exact schedule over here. So our next speaker is going to be Gideon Avni, and he serves as a chief archaeologist for the Israel Antiquities Authority and professor of archaeology at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and at the University of Haifa as well. His academic interests focus on various aspects of classical, late antique, and Islamic archaeology, the archaeology of Jerusalem, its hinterlands, nomads, sedentary societies in the desert, all stuff that's relevant to what we're doing here, and diffusion and movement of technology, plant species, and people across Eurasia, environmental archaeology. During the past 40 years, he has conducted extensive field work in the Negev Desert, Beit Govrin, the Judean lowlands, Jerusalem, Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is quite interesting material there, and around the city, as well as at Ramla, capital of early Islamic Palestine. He's authored 6 monographs and more than 150 articles, and his recent books are Unearthing Jerusalem, 150 Years of Archaeological Research in the Holy City, with Katerina Galor, and the Byzantine Islamic Transition in Palestine, an archaeological approach, and Roman Jerusalem, a new old city. His topic today is going to be Between the Desert and the Sown, Mobile Societies in the Southern Levant, from Roman to Islamic Rule, Some Perspectives and Misconceptions, and Professor Avni.
Thank you. Thank you, Larry, for this kind introduction. And special thanks to Fiona and to Yifat for organizing this very interesting workshop in which I'm going to share with you mainly some questions or some thoughts about interconnectivity between mobile population and sedentaries, and we will be going again into the southern Levant. And I think that the first point that has to emphasize when dealing specifically with this area is the question of distances. Because as you can see from this map, the connections between mobile, sometimes highly mobile populations and the centers of kingdoms, empires, Mediterranean area, the distances are very short, so we're dealing with issues of core periphery relationships. Of course, there are trade routes that crosses this area, and this area has been, for many periods in history, also border areas between imperial powers and, again, the mobile communities. Now, in order to start the discussion, I would like to make a few preliminary comments, and maybe before that, on the tradition of standing on the shoulders of giants. I want to pay attention first to Ibn Khaldun in his Muqaddimah in the late 14th century, already emphasizing this connectivity. While the Bedouins need the cities for the necessities of life, the urban population needs the Bedouins for conveniences and luxuries. They must be active on behalf of their interests and obey them whenever the cities ask and demand obedience from them. So I think this, in a nutshell, gives you the whole idea of interconnection, especially, and Ibn Khaldun put this very clearly, the asabiyya, the tribal bonding, which is so different in a desert mobile society from the big cities, the centers of sedentary civilization. And the other giants, I believe most of you know, Anatoly Khazanov, who provided a very significant landmark in the study of nomads based on his extensive field work in Central Asia. And you can see that nomads were never autarkic, and therefore in economic, cultural, and political respects were dependent on the relation with the sedentary world. So this is the first aspect I would like to pay attention. And before going into some different patterns of connectivity, just to maybe clear the table from previous views about nomads and empires, which are very much rooted in the colonial attitudes of the 19th century, but are rooted in much earlier period. What you see here is a description of a pilgrim's caravan in the early summer of the 570 CE. The Christian pilgrim from Piacenza in Italy goes along the traditional route from the Holy Land through the Negev to the holy mountain of Sinai. And this is how he describes the encounter with the other, with the people of the desert. You can get the feeling of a Western traveler coming to the East. He is a bit afraid. He doesn't know who are these people coming out from the desert. He needs these people for provisions of water and supplies. And when you read this description, you can see the typical encounter with the other, which is very prominent in the historiography of research, particularly in the Levant. I could take you to a very large network of 19th and early 20th century researchers. For example, Elias Mosil, one of the most detailed ethnographer of the Bedouin cultures of southern Levant, northern Arabia, in his books, the Royal Bedouins and Arabia Petraea, he describes in detail the life of the Bedouins, but again you can see this maybe West-East encounter with the others. I just want to mention another scholar, a very prominent one, Gertrude Bell. In the beginning of the 20th century, provided us the book about the desert and the Sown, in which she particularly show these connections. And I didn't know that March is marked as the Women's History Month, and Gertrude Bell was the single woman working and traveling in the Near East among scores of male scholars that crossed this region, but she succeeded in leaving a very significant landmarks. She was among the founders of the Archaeological Museum in Iraq. She had a major role not only in science but also in politics. Just to see how generation changes, this is the obituary that was written upon his death. She passed away in 1926, almost exactly 100 years ago, praising her achievements. And you can see closed a career in which more than one respect is unique. No other woman of recent time has combined her qualities, the taste and arduous, dangerous adventure, and so on and so on. Her distinguished literary gift, her sympathy for all sorts of conditions, her masculine vigor, some expression that won't pass today any kind of level, but the fact I'm presenting this specifically scholar is to show, that the historiography of the studying of the mobile community of the Near East is very much loaded with this, I would say, colonial approaches. It goes on also in modern scholarship. And this connectivity between, or this connection, to my opinion, biased connection, between modern Bedouin ethnography and, the biblical or the Roman or the late antique past. It is something that has to be treated more with a grain of salt, because it takes you to some venues which create more questions than answer, particularly when it is confronted with the recent both archaeological and anthropological research. One of the questions that takes us to the other side of the spectrum is what happened when the nomads become state builders. For example, one of perhaps the best example from the southern Levant are the Nabateans, which creates, the splendors of Petra. But this is a question that I think crosses Eurasia, because you can look at kingdoms in Eastern Asia, like the Shognu, which has a very similar characteristics to the Nabateans. For example, they build these amazing shrines, which are actually monuments of tombs, and they dedicate much less attention to household or to buildings which were used for household habitation and so on. So, just to frame the discussion in several topics, when we're speaking about different aspects of mobility, we have, first of all, and Yifat just introduced this wonderfully, the issue of main trading route, mobility along the international connecting roads. It incorporates with mobility within the imperial border zones, like the Negev, the Arava, Northern Arabia. But perhaps the major contribution of modern archaeology is the identification of patterns of mobility in the fringe of settled societies, these interactions which I showed in the beginning. And we have to remember that mobility has no similar pattern in different parts of the world. So there's many regional aspects of mobility. Some of the questions we will be asking ourselves, and research has been asking this for quite a few times, is the period and length of mobility. Are we speaking about mobile population on a yearly circle, or kind of transhumans? What are the patterns, the range of movement, the distances? Are we speaking about tens of kilometers, hundreds of kilometers? The question of motivation, why do people move? The push and pull factors, the internal and external factors, forced migrations, willing migrations, who decides, and in which societies mobility are integral part of their identity. The distribution and variations of mobilities within the group is indicated, for example, by the locations of burials and cemeteries and identities that are being developed within these mobile societies. So, to go on to some questions that arises from examples, following this general background, I'm not going to dedicate a lot of time to the issue of mobility along the main trade routes, but just one focus on a section of the so-called incense routes that crosses the Arava Valley and the Negev Highlands between Petra and the Mediterranean, an area which in the past 50 years has been researched in detail, going mainly to excavations of road stations along this section. You can see some of them in the western part of the Arava Valley. Most of these excavations were conducted in the 1980s, 70s and 80s, revealing mainly architecture and dating. We're speaking about Hellenistic, late Hellenistic to late Roman times, 2nd century BC to the 3rd century CE, but questions related to the local economy, how many camels or donkeys were passing through this route, how they were consumed with water and fodder, what were the sources of supply for these caravans. These questions were left unanswered, and the current project tries to specifically target these issues, not by excavating the main site, but looking at the middens and the dung heaps along this desert station, showing the archaeozoological aspects, archaeobotanical, and trying to reconstruct what was called once the carrying capacity of each region in the light of the main caravan trade that was going on in these areas. But perhaps the greatest contributions of southern Levant archaeology to the issue of mobile populations comes from the detailed surveys and excavations which were considering the pastoral nomads' activities in these areas. You know, the red dots you see in these slides. It connects to a major question of the visibility of nomadic activity, and there has been quite a lot of literature about this specific issue. Can we see the remains of temporary nomadic encampments? And I'm not going to take you into the details of these discussions, but the bottom line, at least from my point of view, is yes, we can. We can trace even the most short duration activity in a site. And in order to prove this, I'm just remind another project that has been conducted in the Negev for the past 40 years, tracing the archaeological evidence for modern nomad activity, deserted Bedouin camps along a period. We've been doing this for the past almost 40 years, and these temporary camps, which were used or inhabited for a few months in a year and then were left, and in the yearly circle of nomadism, another camp was created. They can be visible in 40 years, they will be visible in 400 years, and perhaps in 4,000 years, pending that there will not be any change in landscape, in geomorphology, and so on. So this is one issue that has to be mentioned. The visibility of pastoral nomads or mobile society as a whole increases once you see the architectural remains, basements for tents, for huts, and so on. But it can lead you to another bias, and this is the impact of a small population in a certain area. You can see this is a map of a section of the Negev Highland surveys, hundreds of sites. You can speculate about a very large population, but at the same time, a small population, like 400 people, can produce so many sites in a cycle of, let's say, 200 years, because the repetition or the coming back to the site does not deal to a specific location, but it deals with an area. So a small population can create a large number of sites. When it comes to distances from water sources in the desert environments, then you will find these larger concentrations of basements of tents or huts, and it leads you also to a specific use of different sections of such, you can call it a village, you can call it an extended campsite, half built and half used by tents. And it also leads to a very interesting issue concerning the identities of such populations. This is a site which was excavated by Steve Ozen and myself years ago in the southern Negev, which includes different areas of habitation. Of course, the living quarters, the combination of buildings or stone circles that mark the basements of huts, and also a small cemetery which was partly excavated and give a very precise indications of identity. All the burials are done according to the early Islamic traditions, facing, of course, the holy city of Mecca. The issue of identity goes also to the religious cultic aspects, and Yifat has shown it in the previous presentation, the steel cult, which existed in the desert societies of the Negev and of other regions for thousands of years, still exists in this particular period. This site was inhabited between the 6th and the 9th century. And within this period, there is a major political change, political and religious change, the coming of Islam. So in this particular site, a very simple thing happened. The steel cult continues, but it changes location and it changes direction. This structure is facing the holy city of Mecca, according to the Islamic tradition, and very shortly, the standing stone is being replaced by the mihrab zone. Another issue is a connection to agriculture. At a certain point, these populations adopt agriculture either as a necessity, as another means for creating income, and then the fact that agriculture is becoming an integral practice of this, some people will say, agro-pastoral societies, gives another dimensions to changes among mobile population. Just to conclude, the Negev has been a kind of very good laboratory to study these kinds of interactions in different periods, especially when it deals with the shifting boundaries between the settlers and the nomads, the mobile population and the sedentaries. And you can see it along a long time, how the border between agriculture and pastoral areas changes and goes very deeply into the desert, starting in the Roman period and ending in early medieval time. This bonding to agriculture and to water storage capacities provide another interesting dimensions of studying of mobile culture, and this is the dating the process of introductions and abandonment of agricultural areas, and also the issue of land ownership. And again, we have a touch of luck in the Negev, because in the local archives of a small Byzantine village in Nitzana, today on the Israeli-Egyptian border, provide abundant information about daily aspects of interactions of the community who lived in this village and its interactions with the mobile communities around. It goes to many aspects of daily life. The provision of caravan leaders or caravan guides from the Negev to Sinai. We saw these descriptions of the pilgrims caravan sending Bedouins as messengers to other areas, but also reference to a more complex social organization of these nomadic communities. For example, one papyri relates to a newly appointed pilar, which is under the Byzantine administration, but consists of nomadic population. And this takes us to the last point I want to emphasize, and this is the connectivity between mobile population and imperial powers, specifically in the Byzantine early Islamic period. Actually, it starts in the Roman times, in the establishment of the borderline of the eastern limes, which again was treated by many scholars actually as a border in the modern terminology of a border, but it was more a kind of division area controlling activities of mobile communities of nomads along the fringe of the empire. I think Yifat showed this picture of Qasr Bashir, the fortresses which were erected along this border as a means of control, not so much as a military actions against the nomads, but more as a means of controlling movement. And the next stage was the creation of the nomadic powers and kingdoms as part of defending the borders of the empire. Perhaps the best example in the Byzantine period takes us to the 6th century when the Jafnid or Sassanid kingdom was created on the fringe of the empire under the authority, under the control of the Byzantine Empire. So we know the names of the sites related to this kingdom. We know the names of the local rulers from quite a number of inscriptions. This is one of them mentioned, Arid, the king of the Jafnid kingdom. And coming back to the issue of identities, the mobile population adopts some kind of Christianity. For example, this is Tel El-Umeri in Jordan, a church in which one of the Greek inscriptions mention Al-Mundanos de Comes, again an Arab nomad who became integral part of the local administration. Now, everything is connected to major political changes, and the change of this area in the 7th century is, of course, the Islamic conquest, which completely changes the balance between nomads and sedentaries. They shift the borders outside when you look at the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries. So the interaction between nomadic powers and the caliphate, the new imperial powers, is shifting to Central Asia in one hand and to the fringes of the Sahara in another hand. So this completes whole circles of interactions and connectivity between the few Bedouins living in the fringe of the settled society and the major kingdoms or nomadic kingdoms that were created along the first millennium in this area. And it also takes us to some of the fundamental questions of this workshop. Can we identify comparative processes between regions? For me, this is one of the main questions that has to be discussed along these sessions and the others. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we're now open for questions. I guess we can take questions. First, maybe we'll see if we can get, for particularly this lecture, for let's say the next 5 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes for the discussion as a whole on both. I think it would be a good idea. And again, thanks to both of our speakers. So do we have anybody with a question or comment here? Please wait for the microphone. Wait till you get the microphone.
Oh, thank you for the presentations. Wonderful. I would like to know what is the role of the oasis place on the caravans along the way.
Well, I think the concept of the caravan and oasis is quite different from what you speculate, for example, in Central Asia. Because we do have springs, for example, along the Ava Valley, but the whole system is based on collecting rainwater, for example, between stations. So along these routes, you don't have a big oasis which serves as a center. You do have big or larger settlements like Elusa in the Negev, like Petra, which are being served as a kind of hubs for this caravan trade. But it goes back to a location, to the politics, and less to a creation of an oasis in the desert in which the caravans approach and they get the water from this specific station. Again, I'm speaking about the northern section of the Incense Road, crossing North Arabia and the Arab Valley and the Negev.
Okay. Other questions, comments? Got? Okay. Just grab the microphone. Thank you.
What, if any, was the effect of the decline of Byzantium play in the development of these kingdoms along the south for caravans?
Well, the fact that during the Byzantine period in these particular regions, the economic base changes completely, because the area, the desert area of the Negev, for example, becomes part of the network of vineyards and wine supply to the Mediterranean areas. One of the very famous mosaics from the Negev show a caravan carrying wine amphoras, but not along long distance routes, but from the centers of productions in the Negev to the seaports of Gaza and Ashkelon. So the economy of long-term trade in the Byzantine period is less effective. It is renewed in the early Islamic period when it is worked along the road between Cairo and Central Arabia in Mecca. But in the Byzantine period proper, it is more engaged in local production and transportations of wine into the seaport.
Just a point of information, there was a quite wonderful documentary film made about Gertrude Bell about, 5-7 years ago called Desert Queen, which may be available on Google. And it was very well researched and did justice to her contribution.
Well, it's... you do have traditions of in desert tribes of local leaders, among them queens. At least 2 cases in late Roman and Byzantine East. The problem is when you come to archaeology, it is much more difficult to detect this, these structures of kingdoms. What you see from the inscriptions are some names, and you can see the different organization which has been expressed by the settlements, locations, and so on.
Okay, we have other questions or comments. You can also open up also for Dr. Thareani's paper as well.
Would you mind going back to the slide that says abandoned Bedouin sites, 1982 to 2002?
I can try. You mean this slides? The slides of this one?
The abandoned Bedouin sites.
The abandoned Bedouin sites. It's... Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you. I'm just curious, what do you see when you look at this? Can you explain what's the evidence that you're saying of sites?
Well, it depends when they are abandoned. In the first 10 years, you can see differences in vegetation because of the dung area of animals and so on. After between 10 and 15 years, this disappears because there is no more dung area, but you do see remains of material culture. For modern Bedouins, is plastic items, iron, some pottery produced in Gaza. But you can see, for example, what you see here in the lower left is the traces of the fireplaces, which remain visible these are actually the marks that you can see them after hundreds, maybe thousands of years, the burned stones and so on. It is not typical only to the Negev. I think this visibility exists in every arid area which is not subject to depositional and erosional processes. For example, in the big, less areas, even in Mesopotamia, I would guess, deposition and erosion can erase completely sites. In places like the Negev or southern Jordan, the possibility to identify sites, nomadic sites, goes back to the Neolithic period.
Okay, we have the microphone, please. As I say, we can open up on both papers now.
Yeah, and another question about campsites. I guess one of the difficulties with campsites is that they tend to be reused several times through history. For instance, in the Black Desert of Jordan, the Dutch team has shown that the campsites they identified were reused from the Neolithic to the late Islamic period. So I know Steve Rosen has made a settlement history of nomads in the Negev of a very long period. But how can you make sure that you actually identify all the periods of use of these campsites based on the survey? Well, without excavating all of them. Because, well, sometimes nomads don't use or don't leave pottery. So how can we deal with a large-scale survey of these?
Well, first of all, we can identify multiple use of the same site, particularly around the few permanent water sources, like spring and so on. And then the location changes between periods. If you're going specifically into the Negev, you have periods in which campsites are located more near the arable areas or a bit arable areas in the plains, and other periods in which the location goes to the hilltop. The fact is that the Roman Byzantine period is the most, I would say, impressive in terms of number of sites. But you can identify Iron Age, you can identify, once it goes to flint artifact, you can identify Neolithic, so on, and there is reuse of sites. It happens that in the same site you will see 2 or 3 periods because it is located in a very favorable place.
Okay. Others, questions, comments? Maybe having a longer coffee break than we were scheduled to. I see the bosses over there. One last chance. We'll go. It's like going once, going twice, and like in an auction, right? Okay, so we want to express our thanks to both of our speakers for wonderful presentations. And I think I can only make one comment as we go along here. I had said at the beginning that we're being opened up to different perspectives. And apparently that will be continuing, and we'll keep going through our program. So we again thank the 2 speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you.